Okay, everyone, so I'm here to introduce Blaise Alleyne. He is a technologist, musician, writer, and advocate for software and cultural freedom based in Toronto, Ontario. He has studied computer science, English, and philosophy at the U of T and is currently a part-time student at U of T, now doing his master's in theological studies. So he is here to present software freedom in a networked world.
Thank you. So for those of you who were here for Jeff's presentation beforehand, he provided a lot of useful information about the architecture of federated systems and some of the things that he's been working on to improve on that a little bit. And if you didn't see that presentation, it would be worth checking out when the video is uploaded a bit later. I'm not going to go into the same detail on the architecture of federated systems, but rather try and give you a sense of the importance of software freedom in our current computing environment, which is heavily based on the web, the network, the cloud, all that kind of stuff. So first, I think it's really important to have some context and history here. So in the mid-1980s, a man named Richard Stallman announced the GNU project, and shortly thereafter he started the Free Software Foundation. And the GNU project was a project to create a free as in freedom operating system, an operating system that respects your freedom. Because in the 80s, the problems that he saw with computing and with users' rights and users' freedom were with proprietary software on your computers. There were a variety of proprietary Unix operating systems. IBM was the big bad in 1984, and Apple, who was trying to take down the big bad, hasn't turned out to be much better. And confronting increasingly draconian copyright law and non-disclosure agreements and later patent law being applied to software to restrict our freedom and control over it, he felt that it was essential and important to build a free operating system. So he launched the GNU project. Now, when we talk, well, when I use the word free today, when we use the word free software, like in the Free Software and Open Source Symposium, that refers to free as in freedom, not free as in price, right? So the free software definition that was developed out of the GNU project and the Free Software Foundation identifies 4 essential freedoms for software. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program for any purpose. So you could run it to make money, or you can run it for nonprofit reasons. You can run it for whatever you need to do. There's not somebody else who's telling you what you can or can't use it for. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study how the program works and to change it, for which the source code is required. That's important for education. It's important to be able to audit the software and make sure it does what it says it does and that you can trust it. Freedom number 2 is the freedom to share copies with other people, so you have the freedom to help your neighbor. Software and digital goods are essentially infinite goods. It costs us nothing to reproduce them. And the only reason that we wouldn't be able to share them and to use that software and to help other people is because of restrictions that people place on it. So from a perspective of software freedom, it's really important to be able to share the software that you have to help other people. And lastly, freedom 3 is the freedom to redistribute your modified versions, which gives the whole community a chance to benefit from changes that you might make. So this is not a talk about software freedom in general. That could be a whole other talk. If you're interested in, I'm going to assume because you're here at the Free Software and Open Source Symposium, you have at least some familiarity with software freedom and open source software. If you want to learn more, a good place to go is gnu.org/philosophy in terms of making the case for why software freedom is important. But I think what's important for today and for my talk today is just understanding that's the context in which the free software movement was started, from which the open source movement later emerged. And facing those problems of proprietary software on the desktop in the 1980s, that was at the forefront. Fast forward through the 90s, the GNU operating system gets combined with the Linux kernel in the early 90s, and for the first time you could actually run a free software operating system on your computer. Meanwhile, Microsoft's becoming more and more dominant, and as you get through the 90s, you have Windows being the dominant computing environment, Microsoft Office, Internet Explorer, to the point where in the early 2000s, when the Ubuntu GNU Linux project launched, their bug number one was that Microsoft had dominant market share. So through the 80s, through the 90s, into the 2000s, the problem that the software freedom movement was really trying to solve was unseating IBM or Microsoft, was being able to run free software on your computer so that you can use software on your own computer that respects your freedom. In Cory Doctorow's book, Makers, from 2009, he expresses the importance of this with the following dialogue. So this is an excerpt from the book. Lester picked up a screwdriver. You see this? It's a tool. You can pick it up, you can unscrew stuff or screw stuff in. You can use the handle for a hammer, you can use the blade to open paint cans, you can throw it away, loan it out, or paint it purple and frame it. But he thumped the printer. This Disney in a box, this thing is a tool too, but it's not your tool. It belongs to someone else, Disney. It isn't interested in listening to you or obeying you. It doesn't want to give you control over your life. If you don't control your life, you're miserable. Think of the people who don't get to run their own lives. Prisoners, reform school kids, mental patients. There's something inherently awful about living like that. Autonomy makes us happy. Now, I don't think autonomy is sufficient for human flourishing, but human autonomy is a basic desire and basic human need. And we're not just talking about screwdrivers, but we can increasingly use our computers to organize our social lives, for our civic engagement, to find health information, et cetera, et cetera. So much more of our lives is being mediated through software. But the change over the last decade, for example, bug number one was recently closed from the Ubuntu project. It was controversial, but part of the reason is they were recognizing that Windows no longer has majority market share because of the prevalence, say, of Android. Once you start counting mobile and tablet computers, it's a different situation. But let's put it this way. What are some of the apps that you feel like you can't live without today? Or that people feel like they can't live today? The kind of applications that you're using all throughout the day. It's no longer your Office productivity suite. It's no longer Microsoft Word or your basic operating system, but it's things like Gmail and Skype and Facebook and Dropbox, right? So the fight for the free software desktop, in one sense, there's been a bit of a success because you have Android and Chrome machines that are running some amount of free software. But we're increasingly using our computers, be they mobile or tablet or desktop computers, to access proprietary network services. It's no longer enough to just have software freedom on your own computer when you're doing so much of your computing on other people's computers. So there's a new problem that has emerged. And the network effects are strong here too, right? I mean, how many people in this room don't use Skype? Show of hands for people who don't have a Skype account. That's impressive. That's impressive. It's really hard when you're working with a team and you're trying to explain to somebody why you can't join the Skype meeting. Oh, it's free to download. You can just install it, right? The network effects are strong. People expect that, of course, you're going to be on Skype. Of course, you're going to be on Facebook. Of course, you're going to be using all these services because they're such a part of the daily lives of most computer users these days. So I'm here to tell you that not only can you live without these applications, but that you should live without them, because the world would be a better place if we can forego these proprietary centralized walled gardens and help to push towards a future of network services that actually respect your freedom. It's not always easy, but I hope to share some tips and tricks about my experience in taking incremental steps toward the goal, and also to give you a sketch in a general sense of some of the efforts that our community has been making to define the problem, define solutions, and then actually work towards building those. So, what's wrong with proprietary centralized walled gardens in the first place? First of all, the same things that are wrong with proprietary software in general. You're surrendering control over your computing, and as I said, it's increasingly central to everything that we do. Those basic 4 freedoms, right? You're giving up the freedom to audit the source code, to actually know if the software says what it does, or if it's got a backdoor for the NSA, et cetera, et cetera. But as that NSA problem highlights, when you're dealing with proprietary network services, a lot of those problems are amplified. They're on steroids, and there's a whole host of other problems that emerge. So the obvious one is privacy concerns. First, you have corporate actors. You have data mining and targeted advertising. Sometimes that might be convenient, but a lot of the time you have little control or often knowledge about how your data is actually being used, how it's being shared, what controls are being put on the information that you're receiving. It gets even worse, too, when you have large proprietary social networks like Facebook or Twitter or Google+, because they can track you all over the web using cookies. For example, every time you go and you read an article on a website that has some kind of Facebook like button embedded that's making requests to facebook.com, when you have Facebook cookies, they're going to be getting hits to their web server that's showing that it's coming from that article on that page, right? There's huge surveillance networks that are being put in place by the prevalence of a few massive social networks all throughout other websites. It's really hard to totally escape them. Security concerns. A giant honeypot will attract bears. So when you have giant centralized databases like Facebook's or Google's, they're obvious and far easier targets for CSIS or the NSA or other crackers, other kinds of government or criminal actors. You also have a single point of failure. So that could be your Twitter fail whale kind of thing, or your occasional Gmail outages. But it's not just fleeting inconveniences, but also you can get more permanent problems with massive data leaks. So when companies like Target get hacked, and all their customer data, or a good chunk of that, gets released, there's no undoing that, right? If Gmail goes down and you're relying on it, it's going to come back up soon. But if some of your private data is now public, there's no putting the cat back in the bag. Similarly, several years back, when Google launched Buzz, its early failed attempt at a social network, there was a privacy bug that exposed a lot of your contacts with the way that they turned it on by default. And they fixed it really quickly within a few days. But you can't undisclose that information about who you were connected to in your Gmail account, which you thought was private, that was all of a sudden made public for a couple days. Lock-in. So lock-in gets even more serious with network services because of the network effects. It's no longer just a personal decision of whether you're going to use Microsoft Office or LibreOffice, but there's a social element to that decision. So anyone who's not on Facebook or who has deactivated for a considerable amount of time, you sometimes, depending on your community of friends or your social circles, you just simply stop getting invites. You stop hearing from your friends or your contacts, because that's where they're having those conversations. So the effect is that you have little choice in your service provider, right? If people are using Skype or Google Hangouts, you either join or you don't participate in those conversations. we don't accept this for other communication systems, right? It would be abhorrent if today you needed to become a Rogers customer to call another Rogers customer, or you needed to get a Hotmail account to email another Hotmail user. But that's how it works for Facebook, for Twitter, for Dropbox, etc. Services shutting down are a big problem with that lock-in too. Google Reader being a big famous example of that a couple years back, where Google shut down the service that was kind of the de facto standard that people were using for RSS subscriptions. Inspired the XKCD comic number 1361, which said, "The rumors are true. Google will be shutting down Plus, along with Hangouts, Photos, Voice, Docs, Drive, Maps, Gmail, Chrome, Android, and Search, to focus on our core project, the 8.8.8.8 DNS server." But in all seriousness, those services go away, right? It could be something as big as Google Reader, or commonly, small startups get acquired. They get bought out for their talent or merged into something else, and services that people rely on disappear on a regular basis. Also, migrations are not always planned. A famous example was that of Matt Honan, who wrote about his experience in Wired magazine in 2012. Through a combination between some flaws in Apple and Amazon's security system, and I believe some social engineering attacks, all of his accounts fell. His Google, Twitter, Apple, and Amazon accounts were all destroyed by a cracker. And worst of all, he writes, worst of all, his Apple ID account was when it was broken into, the attackers used it to remotely erase all of the data on his iPhone, iPad, or MacBook, and his MacBook. So he lost all of his data and all these services overnight. Or there are other stories that people will tell of getting locked out of a Google account. And there isn't exactly a customer service department that you can call. If you don't know somebody high enough to kind of help you out, you could lose access to your data. So sometimes you don't really have a choice about migration too. A couple other examples of problems, I think, when you're dealing with the cultural effects on our relationship and communications. So a recent story that was getting a lot of press was Facebook's experimentation on how its algorithm affects users' moods, right? And I think some of it was overblown because what they were doing was pretty standard user testing that any service would do, but I think that's the story. That's the default, you know, that when we're all relying on one company's system to decide how we receive that kind of social information, it has serious effects on who we hear from, who we stay in touch with, how we're feeling that day. If Facebook's, you know, showing us a bunch of posts of other people saying that they're happy and their life is great, or that they're terrible and this is bad, you know, that has real effects on how we feel. Or Eli Pariser described what he termed the filter bubble in a book several years back, about the effects of the echo chamber with the hyper-personalization of these proprietary network services. So if you are conservative and have a lot of conservative friends on Facebook, you're not going to get a lot of liberal news kind of thing, right? I've seen that experience in both ways on Facebook, where I've had a lot of communication with a small circle of people, and then for a few months, that's all Facebook wants to give me. Or in what I consider a recurring joke, I had one big debate with 4 or 5 acquaintances on a controversial subject 3 or 4 years ago, and now every time more than one of us will comment on the same post, Facebook just shoves it out to the rest of the group, brings us back together like it's a big reunion of friends or something, right? But it's so hypersensitive in terms of how it's selecting the kind of data that we see, and we don't have control, and there's no transparency over that. Lastly, I'd raise the issue of censorship, right? Our public squares are increasingly private property. So much of the public conversation is happening on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and these kinds of services. So when you have controversial topics like, say, videos and discussions of the beheadings of journalists by ISIS. You know, there are serious questions about whether those videos should be shared or viewed, whether they're essential or whether that's abhorrent. But the people who are given the responsibility of deciding that are a few companies that control where most of the conversation is happening. So it's not the public that's making a decision, or it's not individuals that's making a decision, it's Google or Facebook that are given that power and responsibility. Or in the case of web search, most of the world relies on a secret algorithm from a single company as their first step towards looking up information online with Google's web search. No matter how highly you hold Google, you may or may not hold Google in regard, that's a lot of power to give to one company for one algorithm that you can't even audit. Anyways, these are just a few examples of the problems. There are obviously far more things that we could go on and talk about, but I think the important point that I'm trying to make right now is just that there are all the reasons that you need that you want to have software freedom on your desktop that apply to proprietary centralized walled gardens, but plus a whole bunch of new problems that are far more serious and far more difficult to solve. So how do we solve them? So as Jeff mentioned in his presentation before this, if you had the source code for Facebook, you wouldn't actually be able to run Facebook because the source code isn't enough. The software isn't enough. It's the network, it's the users, it's the connection, right? Simply being able to install Facebook on your own server, even if you had a massive data center, is not going to allow you to speak to other people, because Facebook is not designed to talk to other Facebooks, right? Free software is essential, I think, but it's not enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient. Our community has been grappling with this problem in many ways over the past several years. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples. As I go through this, there's no way that I could cover or that I'm even aware of all the different efforts, but I just kind of want to give you a quick tour of what I've kind of noticed and seen people and groups doing to try and solve these problems. So, for example, on the licensing side, copyleft is a tool that developed out of the 80s for software licenses to reverse the effects of copyright in the service of software freedom. Copyleft licenses like the GNU GPL, which is one of the more popular licenses for free software, takes copyright and says, yes, I am the owner, I have all the rights, blah, 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 but rather than restricting your freedom, I'm going to say you actually have these freedoms, and the only requirement is that when you pass the software along to somebody else, you need to make sure they have the same freedoms. That's the basic premise. When you get to network services, though, there's what was come to be known as the application service provider loophole. Those copyleft licenses were based around a desktop model where they were triggered when you distributed the software, when you gave somebody else a copy to run it. But when the software is being run on a web server, users don't actually receive a copy of it. So even software that's copylefted, there's no requirement to share the source code under those standard copyleft licenses if you're running it on your server, as long as you're not giving it to somebody else. So in 2007, when version 3 of the most popular copyleft license, the GNU GPL, was launched, there's also a new license that came into the official suite called the FSOSS GPL, which was basically the same standard GPL with an extra provision that basically says if the software is designed to be run on a network, accessed by users via the network, then you have the obligation to distribute the source to. So that new license has been one effort to try and close that loophole and apply copyleft or make it available for network services. But that's just one tool that the community has tried to develop. Another solution that's been discussed is simply avoiding network services altogether. This can be an obvious yet overlooked point, it's often very important to ask, do you really need to use a network service to accomplish what you're doing? For example, I use Thunderbird or IceDev as my email client, as my primary email client. It runs on my computer. I have a free software web client too, but you don't necessarily have to use a web client. But at the same time, this isn't a comprehensive solution because the heavy trend in computing is away from the prominence of the desktop PC towards mobile computers and network services. If the software freedom community doesn't have an answer and a solution to that, I think we'll get left behind. So in March 2008, there was a working group put together that met at the Free Software Foundation called the Autonomous Working Group. And they released a Franklin Street Statement, which is one of the early attempts to try and get towards a definition of what does it mean to have freedom in network services. They didn't feel comfortable with the definition, but they published some guidelines for developers, service providers, and users. For developers, they suggested use the AGPL, that copyleft license for network services. Develop replacements for popular non-free network services. And develop replacements for centralized services and data storage with distributed software and data deployment, giving control back to users. So again, in Jeff's presentation before, you can see an example of him doing many of those things. To service providers, they suggested use free software, release your customizations as free software, and make the data and user content available to users under legal terms in formats that allow users to migrate. So if it's private data, users should have control. If it's data that's available to all users, like more kind of public information, they recommended that it be made available under a license approved for free cultural work, so like a Creative Commons attribution license, for example, so that people had the legal freedom to use that as well. And then to users to carefully consider whether or not to use any particular network services in the first place, and then if you do decide to do so when selecting them, look for services that essentially follow the guidelines above. From that, in my own thinking, I kind of think about 4 criteria that I evaluate when I look at network services. The first is it free software? Do you have the option to self-host it one day if the company goes out of business or whatever? Can people audit the source code, et cetera? 2, do you have control of your data? I think it's not just, I think control of your data is important, but open standards are critical too. If you look at the difference between a Facebook data dump versus, say, a Google data dump, Google tends to provide your data in much more usable formats to actually migrate somewhere else. Whereas the last time I tried a Facebook export, it was less than inspiring. And also not just exports, but local storage, for example. Does the service store your data on a server, or does it actually store it on your computer? Or if it's stored on the server, does it make it easy for you to have regular automated copies cached or backed up on your computer? So it's not some big event to have to run an export, but it's just part of the normal process of using the service that your data resides, or at least a copy of it, resides somewhere that you control. The third criteria, as I think about it, is privacy or encryption. I think this is a little tricky to define because there are so many different types of network services. Privacy in the context of a collaborative document editor might be very different than a kind of public media sharing service or your own kind of personal remote storage so you can access something from multiple machines. But I think the keys here is, first of all, privacy policies are not enough. You need privacy by design. It's not a question of what does a service provider say they're going to do, but who actually has access to the data in the first place. One solution here is client-side encryption. The original Mozilla Firefox Sync was a great model of this. I don't think they're doing that anymore in the more recent update with the Firefox accounts. But in the old version, the original version, when it synced your Firefox data, all the decryption was taking place client-side. So Mozilla, even if you use their hosted service and you didn't self-host, they would never get your private key. So even if they wanted to decrypt your data, they wouldn't be able to. You don't have to worry about, like, it's not a trust us, we're not going to look at it kind of privacy policy, but it's a trust us, even if we wanted to look at it, or even if somebody tried to force us to look at it, there's not enough time until the heat death of the universe for us to decrypt the data kind of privacy policy. Another obvious one, which was more of an issue, well, it's less and less of an issue because people are doing it, but it's still really important, just encrypting data in transit, right? HTTPS over HTTP, because there's a lot of snooping and spying and surveillance that happens when that's not an essential part of the system. Lastly, the fourth criteria that I think is really important is distributed systems. So in many cases, when possible, fully distributed peer-to-peer systems would be ideal. Federated systems are at least a step in the right direction away from centralized walled gardens. So great examples of federated systems that we're all using are email, right? Everybody has different email servers and they can all talk to each other. There's no reason why a lot of other services can't operate in the same way. I'm going to skip ahead through some of this stuff, but I'm just going to mention a couple other things that you might want to look up on your own if you're interested. Just in the last few weeks, I discovered a more recent working group called GNU Consensus. So if you go to gnu.org/consensus, you'll find links to the mailing list and the wiki. And that's a more recent attempt to kind of reach a consensus among the community on the next decade's strategy for privacy-preserving free social network services. So what are the kind of key criteria that the community can kind of agree on are essential, or what kind of things are people still debating or kind of unsure about? So a lot of interesting stuff there that I've just begun to explore. Also, the W3C has a social web working group. They're focused on, I guess, more developing federation protocols or open standards that can be easily implemented by applications on the web. Jumping ahead, with the Franklin Street Statement back in 2008, there was a push to create some new services. One of the recommendations was to develop alternatives to popular proprietary services, right? So you had projects like StatusNet, which emerged initially as basically a Twitter replacement, or GNU FM as a Last.fm replacement, the music audio scrobbling service. One of the strategies that both these projects employed was to implement the proprietary services APIs so that clients for those services were immediately compatible. So for every music player out there that could scrobble your music plays to Last.fm, GNU FM has the same API, so you just change the server URL and instantly all those music clients are compatible. Same with StatusNet in the early days. You could take a Twitter client and just point it at a StatusNet instance.
Yeah. I think the project is called LibreFM.
GNU FM is the name of the project. LibreFM is the name of the flagship instance. That's one server that runs it.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, that's a good example, because one of the major problems with some of these initial attempts is with those flagship instances. So LibreFM was the service that you can go and sign up for that runs the GNU FM software, and it's the most popular one. On the StatusNet side, it was a service called Identica that was the most popular one. But what happened is everyone kind of created accounts at Identica. So even though it had federation, a huge disproportionate amount of users were still all in the same server anyways. More recently, Identica has migrated to a next generation social networking service called Pump.io, and the creator has taken some steps to try and combat that problem by making it easier to run your own service. It requires less resources, and by closing the ability to create new accounts on Identica. So you can create accounts, but it picks like a random pump.io server if you want an account on somebody else's server. So to try and spread those users out and make use of the fact that it can federate. I'm going to quickly mention a few other projects, but I want to leave some time for Q&A. OwnCloud has emerged as a kind of replacement and alternative for Dropbox, or even more recently, kind of Google Docs or Google Calendar or Contacts and Sync. Diaspora was getting a lot of media attention as a Facebook alternative a few years back as well, in terms of general purpose social networking. Really, there are almost too many services to kind of mention, but GNU.org/consensus had a good list of a bunch of them that are kind of still active. Some of them federate with each other, some of them kind of only federate with themselves. But there's a lot of interesting stuff, and some of it has kind of not been very successful, and other services have been really successful. So that would be a whole other talk, kind of case studies on what some of these projects are doing right and wrong. The one other that I would mention is GNU Media Goblin, which is a media sharing service, and they're working on federation with a Pump API right now. So it's functioning as a like YouTube, SoundCloud, Flickr, Instagram kind of replacement, but one that's not only free software, but actually federates with other free software networks. But I want to spend some time talking about my experience de-Googlifying. I use the term not as an anti-Google thing, but as an anti kind of proprietary network service thing, because Google is, most of Google's services are kind of the epitome of proprietary network services. After I became aware of free software and kind of switched to GNU Linux on my desktop, I slowly began to realize the gravity of the problem with network services. And I'm a web developer and sysadmin, so I have some skills and some of the ability to kind of play around with these services. So I've been slowly trying to disentangle myself from Google and related or similar services. Also, this was in my switch, in my post-Palm Pilot era. The old model of kind of your handheld computer syncing with your desktop computer has been replaced by your kind of network service that you can access from your desktop, mobile, tablet, or web client. That kind of model. So as I was dealing with that in my own personal computing transition, that was one of the problems I was trying to solve. So if people have questions about any of these particular services, I'd be happy to ramble on about protocols and projects and stuff during Q&A. But I'll just do a little crash course through some of these. So briefly, with email, this is by far one of the easiest, but it's also one of the most depressing. Benjamin Mako-Hill, who's an academic and free software hacker and an advocate, he recently did a kind of informal data analysis on his own email to try and figure out, he's been running his own email server for 15 years. And he was trying to figure out how much of his email was on Google servers anyways, because other people are using Gmail. And in his networks, which are pretty heavy on free software and open source people, he still found that more than half of the email that he sent last year was in reply to someone using a Google server. So even though he's putting all this time and money and effort into like, okay, I'm going to get my email on my own server, it's really a social and an ecological problem, because if all the people he's talking to are still using Gmail, it doesn't matter where he puts his email account, a ton of his email is still going to be there. But email's actually one of the easiest, just because the protocols have been around forever and the standards are there. And I think it's a good example too of the transitional steps that I tried to take. It's far easier to take baby steps than to do it all at once. So with email and with calendaring systems too, one of the things that I've tried to do is change the front end before I change the back end. So Google supports IMAP fully. You can connect to your Gmail service from an IMAP client like Thunderbird or iStuff or Roundcube as a webmail client. I shifted away from using Gmail in my day-to-day email to using a free software client. And then at the end of the day, when I switched my email account from Gmail to another server, I didn't even notice the difference by that point in time because I was using the same email client. Or same with the calendaring. Google Calendar, I think they talked about killing this but didn't. At least a few years back, they were supporting CalDAV, which is a similar open standard protocol for calendaring systems. And I moved away from the web interface to using Lightning or IceOwl, and got used to that in my daily routines using a free software CalDAV client. And then at the end of the day, when I switched my calendar from Google's hosted service to my hosted service, I didn't notice any difference. So being able to make transitional steps like that is really big and really important.
So just to interject there,
Yeah.
like to make actual names, what are you using for email now in the back end?
So on email, I run a few web and email services for myself and clients anyways. I'm using Dovecot as an IMAP server, Postcot for, Postfix for SMTP, Roundcube for webmail, Postgre and Spam Assassin for spam filtering. Postgre, which is gray listing, it basically makes an SMTP server try again after a certain period of time. It does wonders for killing 90% of spam because most spam servers just try once and they don't actually follow the. Postgre is an implementation of gray listing for Postfix. It just kills most spam before you even need to put it through Spam Assassin. Then Roundcube as a webmail client, IMAP, which allows me to have my email on my server and access it from any number of IMAP clients on my mobile device, my laptop, or via Roundcube as a webmail client.
So you're running this on like a virtual private server? Or?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Email in particular, in terms of being always accessible and that kind of thing. With some of the other solutions, like my calendar server actually runs out of my living room on my home computer. It's a lot easier to self-host some things like that. I have several services that are running on my home computer. You basically just open up the ports in your network router, point them towards your computer, and then maybe get a static IP address if you can, or just map a domain name to your IP address, which doesn't change that often with most service providers anyways.
Recommendations in that in terms of having a static IP, like what service would be good for a home user to go with?
I don't know.
I'm with TechSavvy, for instance, and
I would recommend
I actually pay
$4 a month for the static IP. Yeah. I used to do that. I used to do that too. I mean, I recommend TechSavvy for other reasons. I switched over to TechSavvy Cable though, which doesn't have a static IP. But honestly, my IP address changes 3 or 4 times a year, so I just update the DNS record.
Oh, I was going to suggest I got rid of my static IP and switched to DIN.
That's
so that
yes.
way it automatically, and you can program it right into your router.
Right.
And it'll automatically send your IP address to DIN and to your domain name, and it'll automatically go back to your house.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've heard of them before, and it's a good service?
I find it's useful.
Okay.
I miss the static IP, but at the same time.
Right.
Okay.
I'm essentially using my own kind of dynamic DNS because I'm running the DNS server too. But whether you're self-hosting at home, I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, you need some more skills to self-host, but I like the fact that my data is in my house, and you know that I have full control over that computing environment. But there are also self-hosting options on VPSs or dedicated servers. And also just knowing that you have the ability to self-host or kind of hire your friend to self-host. Or actually, this is a good time to plug this. Sergio, who's speaking in this room next, and I and a couple others have recently been putting effort into reviving a group called LibrePlanet Ontario. So it's a local group of software freedom advocates and users, and one of the things that we're talking about doing is hosting some of these services for members. So For example, having a GNU social server. So if you want a GNU social account, you can sign up, and as a community, we'll kind of manage the server and do that kind of thing, right? So the ability to self-host means that a local community group could do it, or you could do it yourself on a VPS or at home. And that LibrePlanet plug too, if you're interested in this kind of stuff and being involved locally, join our mailing list. If you go to lists.libreplanet.org, you will find the LibrePlanet Ontario list there, and you can sign up, and our next meetup will be mid to late November in the Young Eglinton area. So, yeah.
I have another question about the, back to your freenet, the software networks.
Yeah.
What do you think of a company like, a website like GitHub? They do lots of good work. Some of their code is open source, most of it isn't. I love the, I mean, it works really well, but I'm torn because it isn't all free. There have been other attempts, like Victorious and stuff, but they're not as good. So I was just curious.
Right.
Lots is good.
I think GitHub is so indicative of the problem, and I think it's also so indicative of the problem of what I call geek complacency. So first of all, Benjamin Mako-Hill has another great essay called "Free Software Needs Free Tools," right? And it's critical that if we're building free software, that we can use free software to build it. And GitHub has free software components under the hood, but the fundamental application is not free software, right?
I agree fully, but I have yet to see something that works as well.
Right, and so that's what I mean by geek complacency. And I mean, it can take a lot of work, but this is why I think it's so important and why I've tried to do this myself. If people who have the ability to make a better GitHub aren't doing so and they're just using GitHub instead, or people who have the ability to make a better Gmail but aren't doing it, they're just using Gmail instead, we're not going to get a better free software version of it, right? I think there's been a real lack of innovation in email services, in free software email services over the last 10 years because people have been so complacent with Gmail. And then people are complacent with Gmail because it's a lot of work to host your own email, and because Gmail works really well and the other stuff doesn't work as well. But why doesn't it work as well? Because everyone's just using it and they're not putting their effort into building something new. So, I mean, I understand the decisions, and I make those decisions and trade-offs all the time, but I think especially for those of us who have the talents and the skills and the ability to try and help push this forward, there's a real responsibility to try and, as much as possible, do that and support the alternatives and help them move forward. And I would say one other thing there too, in terms of my Facebook experience, with the network effects and the kind of public squares, I mean, GitHub is where so much of the development happens, right? Or Facebook is where so much of the communities are. I think that we need kind of strategies to deal with that in an incremental way. So I don't have time to go through it in detail, but I'd recommend checking out the website indiewebcamp.com. They have a lot of practical solutions around the social networking side of things for kind of publishing on your own site and syndicating elsewhere, so you can still maybe maintain a presence. If people are using Facebook, they can kind of read your posts, but your posts aren't living on Facebook, they're coming back to your own services, right? And you know, similarly for things like GitHub or YouTube, you know, how can, like, what's the right balance for having a presence to kind of reach people or not being totally isolated and kind of invite them in, but not be complacent with staying there, try and bring them in and push them forward to kind of a better alternative.
I'm just wondering, because talking a lot about having the tools to complete the free software, everybody has freedom as in free of speech.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering how attraction would you get for the main public? But just checking steps, Firefox, which is quite open, they spent almost 8 years to take Explorer as the leading browser, and in only 3 years, Google provided Chrome and took the crown in only 3 years.
Right.
And people chose to go with Chrome, me included, just because it has a cleaner interface, and for people who, most people just don't care if it's free or not, as in freedom. But they have a good software, it works for them, they would take it.
Right. So how do we get users there? I mean, I don't know what the answer is, but the way that I look at it is that we need to keep making the free software versions better and better and better. I mean, if you look at Firefox pre-Chrome, it got all that market share because it was better. Or if you look at if you look at WordPress and its kind of dominance over web development and how much of the internet it powers, it's not necessarily because people are familiar with software freedom and selecting it. It's because it's really good and it's really useful at what it does. And the fact that it's free software kind of helps that, because it means you can go and run it on your own server and tinker it and customize it, right? With social networks, I feel like, and this is my own personal thought, I feel like with the rise and fall, like from Hi5 to Friendster to MySpace to Facebook, et cetera, you know, it's a matter of time before the titans will fall. And I think what's important is that the free software solutions are ready to kind of take their place when they do. I think that's the biggest opportunity. Like, it might not be in the next generation or that, but if we keep kind of making them better, eventually when people are leaving one of the proprietary services, I would hope that some of the free services would be kind of good enough to be attractive to mainstream users as a substitute.
Have you run into any examples of commercially viable, large-scale, free software deployments?
Yeah, so some of these projects are doing it on more of a nonprofit basis, like Media Goblin is doing, you know, crowdfunding and running out of the 501c3 Free Software Foundation kind of green project thing. But there have been some for-profit efforts with varying degrees of success. So StatusNet had a company behind it, StatusNet Incorporated. They seemed to be doing well for a few years, like they had Motorola as a client, you know, and they were doing that kind of thing, but that company is no longer. OwnCloud has an OwnCloud Incorporated behind it, and they have a really strong community. I don't necessarily know how well the company's been doing, but the project's been doing really well. I think our expectations shouldn't necessarily be for like a massive, you know, billion-dollar IPO kind of company, but rather smaller, successful businesses. But
I'm willing to challenge people to come up with how we could make a billion-dollar free software commercial product, because that's the only way that this story gets out there, because no one's going to care about, outside of developers, no one's going to care if we can't say that this will generate you more money than that guy over there who has a closed source.
yes and no. I think the one place where I would disagree a little bit is, like, if you look again at a success like WordPress, it's not that Automatic, the company behind it, is a billion-dollar company. But it's that there's a billion-dollar economy around WordPress with thousands and thousands of companies that make up that economy. And I think that's a more natural commercial ecosystem for free software, not one player kind of having a big part of the pie, right? But a big pie with a ton of smaller players. But I am not opposed to any kind of huge company that can come along and do it in a way that respects freedom and make a ton of money. I'd be super happy. Time? Okay.
4 more minutes.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Yeah, so let me just give you a few websites, and I might have to touch this Windows computer to do it. Where can I type? Oh.
There should be Notepad++ on there.
Okay. I just can't bring myself to write this in Microsoft Word.
You could write on the
Whiteboard, it's open source.
Where is it?
Right up behind you.
Behind me?
The whiteboard.
Oh,
whiteboard.
the physical whiteboard. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? Okay, so I thought you were talking about some application. So look for LPCAON. LibrePlanet Ontario, join our mailing list. I'm also going to recommend, this is not a full endorsement, but this is one of the best lists that I've found. After the Snowden revelations with the Prism Project, this Prism Break website started, there's just a ton of suggestions for projects that exist. So it goes through all the kind of popular proprietary software you might be using as network services on your desktop and what free software replacements are that respect your freedom and your privacy. So that's a really good place to just kind of like find out about dozens and dozens of projects. You know, verify and vet any individual one of them, but that's a great starting point for research.
So let's all thank our presenter.
Thank you.